So, trends in urban fantasy, I believe that it's pronounced Jagi?
Yes.
Okay. I always want to say Jackie. Jagi. Jagi.
Jagi.
Jagi. Jagi is moderating.
Oh,
are you moderating?
You can take it if you want it. It's entirely up to you.
The women are going to
Ready?
arm
Otherwise,
wrestle.
I'd be happy to.
Anyway, there's a I will turn it over to whichever one of you. I'm sorry.
You can have a
Everybody's here, right, Rob? There was one more on the list. Is that someone who did the
Johnson.
Johnson?
Oh, yes. No, she's not here.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. All right. I think I'm just gonna hold this. Hi, my name is Morgan Newquist, and I am moderating this. Unless Jagi wants to step up, but we won't fight over it anymore. I write urban fantasy and superheroes, which is sometimes considered a subsection of urban fantasy, but people fight over that all the time, and we can talk about that later. And fantasy, and then we'll move down from this end, and everyone can give a quick introduction because I think there are a couple people who haven't been on any panels yet. So yeah.
All right, my introduction will be short because I have been on panels throughout the day. My name is Bill Willingham. I'm mostly known for writing a long-running comic series called Fables. More recently, a sword and sorcery comic book series called Fire and Ice. Not the one from DC with the two characters named Fire and Ice, but the one based on the Frank Frazetta Ralph Bakshi movie, which you should go out and get. Lately I've been writing prose that sell in the dozens. That is urban fantasy. My most recent one's about a private eye kind of 900-year-old bastard son of the Queen of Fairy, who is working in modern day, our world, and comes into possession of the hammer of Thor at a time when everyone wants it, and he has to kind of keep it out of nefarious hands. It's called Hammer of the Gods. In the same universe is the remarkable Mr. Finn, about a talking chimpanzee detective. You've all heard of the, what if an infinite number of chimpanzees sat at an infinite number of typewriters and randomly typed that eventually they'd type the complete works of Shakespeare? Yes, Bill, we've heard of that. All right. Well, this is about the one who actually did it. But then his efforts were discounted because in the middle between Twelfth Night and Much Ado About Nothing, he randomly also dashed off 4 Jacqueline Suzanne novels. So they said that discounts you, and he was forced to quit in protest and came to our world and became a detective, the remarkable Mr. Finn. I'm going to do one commercial just because I think mostly these folks should talk. If I get 2 more people signed up for my big game tomorrow, then the game runs. The bad part is it starts far too early, and you have to give up attending really rippingly good panels in order to do that instead. The good part is it solves the mystery of Gilligan's Island, Joe versus Volcano, Lost, Fantasy Island, Skull Island, all of that. Turns out it's been the same place all along, and you guys are going to go do a little exploring. After I leave here tonight, that's either the game's going to happen or it's not. So sign up if you want to.
Have you shown that to my
I
kids?
have your
'Cause
kid. Okay.
He needs his name.
She's offering them up as tribute.
Oh,
One more. And I think there's another fellow who wants to come, but
I thought you were just trafficking in unwanted kids. Ray? All right, Ray. 8 o'clock in the morning, and it stops at noon. So you have to fend for breakfast beforehand and and dash to lunch after.
I know there's a gentleman who wants to come, but I don't know if he knows what time it is. I will
Yeah.
look for his wife and see if I can find
There
her
was
time.
supposed to be a moment of official introduction early in the convention, and it kind of got overlooked.
I'll send her a note.
But it's
He's running a game.
it's called the Island of Mysterious Danger Adventure, or the True Secret of Mr. Howell's Trunk, or whatever you know. There's a dozen other titles for it. It's simply the most exciting tabletop role-playing game you will ever in your life experience. I humbly say. Thank you. That's all. Please take it away.
Okay. My name is Declan Finn. You probably recognize the jacket, if nothing else. If the microphone fails, my father was a professor and a tenor. Trust me, I don't need the microphone to be heard if worse comes to worse. I am the author of 35 novels, most of them published. 20 of them are urban fantasy. I go from space opera to, quote, vampire romance in quotation marks because there are too many explosions for the genre. I write a urban fantasy horror series called St. Tommy NYPD. The horror mostly comes from local politics, but that's a different conversation. I edit books, I write books. I also run a review site called Upstream Reviews on Substack. So if anybody has books they want to send in, we take all comers. We only give positive reviews of books we like. If we don't like your book, nobody will ever know about it.
Okay, this mic won't come forward. Hi, I'm Jagi Lamplighter. I write, currently I'm writing a YA fantasy series about a young British sorceress who goes to a wizard school that's in the middle of the Hudson River. But I also wrote a series that's called either Prospero's Daughter or Prospero's Children, depending which version you get, that is urban fantasy meets Shakespeare and Dante. So it's half urban fantasy and half of it's in hell. I also do some editing, and I also have a writing course that I teach occasionally.
Yeah, I'm Dan Humphreys. I've got a ongoing urban fantasy series called Paxton Locke. Paxton Locke. Basically follows a wizard that starts out as kind of a roaming solutions guy. Sort of like the Equalizer. Ends up working for a fictional government agency, and like I said last year, we know it's fantasy because the fictional government agency is competent. Yeah, that's it.
I guess I should talk about my book for a second, and then we'll go into questions. My urban fantasy book series is called The Neighborhood Watch, and it's about a young girl who takes over her grandfather's position in the neighborhood watch in a neighborhood that is not a normal neighborhood. It's got fantasy creatures and everything in it, and so technically it's a suburban fantasy, but we will let that go for now. Okay,
Buffy versus the HOA.
Yeah, it's Buffy versus the HOA, which is a cabal of evil wizards. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What do you consider urban fantasy? What are the tropes that you think are inherent in the genre that you have to have for it to be urban fantasy? Because I think that's probably why this is titled the way it was. It's Trends in Urban Fantasy, which is kind of funny because I don't think any of us follow the technically popular trends in what we do, but there's a lot of disagreement over what makes urban fantasy, what makes superhero, and what makes paranormal romance. And they all kind of get tossed in the pot together. And what do you think is the distinguishing features that makes it urban fantasy? And we'll start at this end.
Okay. In my mind, urban fantasy is fantasy that takes place in modern day. I don't think it has to be urban per se. But if you if you set your fantasy in other times, even fairly recent other times, there's a point at which if you go beyond it, you're doing a period piece. So it's not that. It's modern or recent with fantasy elements. I would probably argue that superheroes are not a good subset of urban fantasy, other than in a really big tent kind of definition. Superheroes, when done well, are a subset of fairy tales, and I will be happy to explain why. Except, that's a long speech, but
If
yeah.
we run out of questions, we can come back to that and you
that'd
can
be cool.
adventure
pontificate on
stuff,
it.
I think. But it is a big tent.
So I'll just follow up on this real quick. So you think that urban fantasy is more or less synonymous with modern or contemporary fantasy? There's not anything that separates the two?
Oh, I don't know that there's not anything, but as a comfortable definition for me to work in, yeah, that
Okay.
works for me.
And Bill's right, because that's 90% of how it's used. It's urban fantasy and contemporary fantasy are used almost interchangeably. Because, let's face it, Larry Correa's Monster Hunter International mostly takes place at Cazador, Alabama, not in any city, but it's still labeled urban fantasy half the time. When I try using it as urban fantasy, I try to make the city more of a character. I think Bill actually did that a lot with Fables, where New York City as a setting and a character was very alive and interactive with the plot. I actually have a problem with... Okay, I have many problems with Laurel K. Hamilton, but one of my problems with her Anita Blake series is, does St. Louis not have a personality? Or see, because I can't even remember if it's supposed to be Seattle or St. Louis. That's how little personality she gives the town. So, like I said, I think urban fantasy, the city is just more than backdrop. It plays more of a role. It's almost a character in itself. But that's just me.
Is she the one that tried to sue anyone else who had a female adventure character in sunglasses?
God, I hope not.
I think that was someone else.
Well, Laurel mostly does porn now,
Yeah.
so I
Seems to
don't.
be good.
Yeah, that's a long story.
Okay.
Yeah, and and another example I will use in terms of the city being more of a character is the more Jim Butcher goes into the Dresden Files, the more Chicago plays a role as a character, especially in Battleground, where geography becomes important, neighborhood dynamics becomes important. The army of Fey demons march into the wrong part of Chicago and they all got shot. Things like that.
I have quite a different definition of urban fantasy. Urban fantasy, as I tend to understand it, I'm not saying everything that's urban fantasy falls into this category, is fantasy some basically Earth written like noir detective novels. So The Nine Princes of Amber, which is written in the noir detective style, is not urban fantasy. But most of, maybe except at the very beginning, but most of the urban fantasy tropes, at least the earlier ones, there may have been others that have developed since, but were basically Dashiell Hammett and his, Chandler and guys like that. They were taking the style of writing that the noir detectives did and applying it to fantasy, so that the fantasy takes on the same kind of dark and cynical type of mood that you see in a noir. In fact, you did that very well in Fables.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Like with the big bad wolf and things like that. But it has that. It's almost the opposite of a fairy tale, because in a fairy tale, the spirit of the thing is not always visible, but in the noir stories, everything's gray, and so the noir attitude's been taken into the fantasy genre, and the majority of things that are called urban fantasy fall into that category. Now, it's gotten broader than that per se, but that's like kind of where it came out of.
I think that's funny because I remember, and this would have been like 20 years ago, that I submitted a short story to, I believe it was Blackgate, fantasy magazine. And they had in bold, like capital letters on their submission page that we do not want a private investigator with magic doing whatever in whatever story. I don't care what the setting is, why you think it's unique. No more magical private investigators. This is maybe like the early aughts. That's funny. We had a panel in this last year, and I'm kind of trying to remember some of the points that were brought up. I feel like, at least for the more modern urban fantasy, that a hidden world is an important trope with it versus maybe contemporary fantasy where everything's out in the open. A lot of it is that there's something just beneath the surface that you can't see, or that there's monsters living among us, but the normies don't know about it. And you see that in Dresden. I've got it in mine, not that mine's like definitive of the genre, and it seems to be really common. Lindsay Hall's books have it, and I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Dan's books have it, so it's very common to find it that your main character is either someone who has just been introduced to this world that they didn't know existed of magic around them, or sometimes it's someone that's been in it for a long time, and then that's also kind of used as a crutch to start explaining the world and how it is different from ours.
So the hidden aspect is essential, you think?
I don't think it's necessarily essential, but it's very common.
Lord
And-
K. Hamilton was
one of
the
the tropes.
opposite. Hers was a world where everything had come out.
Yeah, there's
That was kind
a
of neat that she did it that way.
there's
but
a
not
Robin
many people
McKinley
know
book that I would consider urban fantasy. And I don't think she's super widely read in these circles, called Sunshine, where everything is out in the open, but I would also consider it
Yeah, in
urban
my
fantasy.
books, everything is out there. There's
Right,
the
yeah.
Department of Lycanthropy and the this and the that.
Right.
And
But it's just something you
registered
really
sorcerers.
see,
Yeah.
and I think some level of it is so that the reader can kind of fall into this idea that maybe they exist in a world where they don't know about things, rather than it's all out in the open, and it kind of removes that suspension of
the reader
disbelief.
says, I don't really feel part of this world,
Yeah.
so maybe I'm part of
Yeah.
the world I cannot see yet.
Mhm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to build off of the hidden world, I think one aspect you see a lot is secret history as well. Oh, this is what really happened at Tunguska, or this is really why they went to the moon, or whatever, things like that. That's fairly common, and I think it's all kind of. It's almost, I think to me, urban fantasy is almost like pornography. I can't really describe it entirely
I
and
know
draw
it
the
when I
picture, but I know it when I see it.
Well, just as an example for open world urban fantasy, I don't know if anybody knows the Nicholas Wood Smith novels. He has a Cat Drummond series. It's all open world fantasy that takes place in a very, very fictional South Africa, where he is from, and he's got about 12 to 13 books in this series, maybe more, and I don't know his politics. They're very neutral. The only politics his heroine, Cat Drummond, has is she really hates politicians and she would like to skewer them anytime she sees them, but, yeah, pretty much. I thought that would go over well here. But it's interesting in that even local myths wind up playing a part within her books, and, he's not even making up the myths. These are myths South Africa already has. So, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's something else, and maybe we can discuss some of that is very common, that often goes hand in hand with the hidden world, is that more than necessarily being original creatures or anything like that, that a lot of the creatures are pulled from urban legend, from fairy tales. You have werewolves, you have vampires. When I write my neighborhood watch books, I actually went digging through rather obscure fairy tale creatures because I didn't want to do the same werewolf, same vampire thing. And I think that's really common. I don't know if anyone has any comments on using fairy tales, urban legends, that kind of thing in the genre.
Well, there's so many. I mean, why reinvent the horse?
Right.
Every culture just is rife with wonderful, wonderful monsters and characters.
Yeah.
When some friends and I, years ago, formed our writing group, Clockwork Storybook, and it was going to be a shared world setting, modern day urban fantasy. Right away, they set as one of the unbreakable rules is that vampires had been done to death, so no vampires in this world whatsoever. And the conversation took place so fast that it had already been decided and voted upon before I even got a chance to think of it. And my first reaction was, well, I had no desire whatsoever to do vampires, but now I need to. Because you can't tell me what to do. I think a lot of the trend, if I know of any, it's in urban fantasy, is I'll do what I want. Is that a little too broad?
No, I hadn't ever thought about that, but I do feel like there's just kind of like a rebellious kind of underlying spirit to a lot of the urban fantasy, whether that's how it's written or that the main characters often tend to be rebellious types that are pushing against things.
Well, as soon as anyone says certain things are dead, this genre is dead,
Someone does
I have to look at it and say, really, or has it just not been well handled lately?
Yeah.
I don't believe in the so-called superhero fatigue of movies right now. I think we have a spate of really, really badly written superhero movies. So
I would love to watch more good superheroes.
right,
Exactly.
we have bad writing fatigue, and that never goes away.
Yes, it's true.
But yeah, anyway.
Okay.
So I think part of the issue with the creatures coming from myth is if you're going to create something new, you have to create a new mood to go with it. But if you're taking whatever it is and you're putting a fedora on it and putting it in a bar, it's much easier to take a familiar thing and then put it into the setting of the city and have the reader then see this unicorn or vampire or fairy now in your new mood than it is to create a thing, try to establish a new mood, and then change it into your urban fantasy mood. So I think that's one reason why people are trying to draw from established things and then show, I'm going to take this established thing, whether it's well-known or very unknown, and then show what it would be like if I bring it into my city.
And one of the advantages of using fairy tales, traditional monsters, is there are monsters from all over the planet. One of the things that makes, I know I'm going into a different kind of fantasy, but with The Witcher, the novels, he's using a lot of Polish and Eastern European monsters, which are relatively new to, anyone west of Krakow. And so that makes it more interesting. But you can do an awful lot just by using traditional monsters with traditional rules. My Love at First Bite series is about vampires in New York City, and I kept all the evil vampires with all the traditional rules, and I have one vampire who is a main character, but who goes to confession, and their idea of imbibing blood is from the chalice at Mass. because when in doubt, let's take "here is my blood" quite literally, and we're good to go. Although one of the recurring lines is, "Yes, I go to confession. Yes, it hurts. Don't ask." And that's how you can keep traditional vampires with traditional rules, and also have basically one who's a superhero. With my St. Tommy series, I basically throw in every monster I can find and then hit frappe, because, I get bored after a while, and it's like, okay, well, this fight was too easy. I have to throw in 3 more monsters and rewrite the fight. And then it's, how do I keep this hero going while he's, getting the crud kicked out of him? So I decided he has to have powered armor. So I basically had golems show up. They got broken around him, and they decided they liked him, so he has golem powered armor. Things like that. And you can just have fun. So yeah, you can take traditional fairy tales all you like. You can take any traditional anything and put a little spin on them. You don't even need to put them in Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, Anyway, that's just me.
Yeah, I think the spin is the best part. I mean, vampires are boring, but Amanda's interesting because it's a totally different set of rules. You think how vampires are supposed to be, and then you have this character that's completely different. In Monster Hunter International, the orcs are good guys. And
Who was it that wrote that
elves are rednecks?
vampires are the most verbose of all monsters?
Yeah.
Because everybody who writes a vampire has to have the scene where the vampire explains, well, this is what's real about vampires, and this is what's legendary, and this works, but this doesn't work, etc., etc. And it's all different. I mean, we burn up in the sun, but these vampires over here explain, oh, we just get extra sparkly and more pretty. It's just
A friend of mine read Twilight.
Every vampire has to explain.
Yeah.
It's like, give me a good werewolf that explains nothing.
A friend of mine read Twilight when it first came out and said to me, I think she's confused. Those are elves.
So that opens up an interesting sort of trend topic to bring up, because I like to beat the topic of Twilight to death, and that Twilight is an excellent example.
With a crowbar?
Twilight is an excellent example of the type of book that it was trying to be, which was not urban fantasy. It is a supernatural YA romance. And if you're looking for that, it is like the genre standard. It's great for that. But it's not urban fantasy, and it's not Anne Rice vampires. And one of the things that has started happening is paranormal romance. And some of this, I'll kind of get on my pedestal because we used to run a publishing company. Some of this is because Amazon does not police its categories. And so, for a long time, everybody would just stick their book in to a category that remotely fit it and hope that they could get a high ranking in it. And so you started seeing superheroes and urban fantasy. I write actual superhero, and the top 50 books are usually urban fantasy books because they put themselves in there. And then you also see the paranormal romance creep. So what do you think separates paranormal romance from true urban fantasy?
Explosions.
Thank God I'm not in paranormal romance.
I'm not comfortable with any entity like Amazon trying to police the genres and stay out of. Do we need more regulation in our life about anything? Science fiction has rivets. Fantasy has elves and dragons. Beyond that, it's whatever you want.
I believe somebody once defined it as, in fantasy, Hugo Weaving looks like Elrond, and in science fiction, Hugo Weaving looks like, one of those Mr. Smiths.
I think part of it is as simple as, what's the story actually about? Because I I edit fantasy, so if I have free time, which is very, very rare, I read a romance because it's completely different from the what I write and what I live and what I work. And I don't actually like mystery in my romance. If I'm going to take one afternoon to read a quick romance, I just want romance. Even though mystery romances are very popular, it's just not, not what I was looking for at the time. And the reason is the type of story is different. So a romance is a story where the main push of the story is trying to keep the two characters apart and yet having them run into each other. But a fantasy is a story where the main push of it is usually anything but that. I mean, usually romances, it can be a good second string in any type of thing. But you have something like, there's a goblin and he's lost his shoe and you have to find it. I mean, it's anything but just the pressure between the couple. But it's really hard to say because you can write a paranormal fantasy that has extra fantasy in it, and you can write a urban fantasy that has a little extra romance. So they do start getting really close to each other.
Is there any genre outside of the fantasy genres? If you're working in the fantasy genre, but most of us, I'm assuming, read widely outside of that.
Yeah.
Any of those other genres and subgenres that you would consider off limits that don't belong in fantasy?
I don't think anything's off limit. I mean, me saying I prefer no mystery in my romance is just personal taste.
Right.
I think it's a great idea, and some of them are very good. That's an interesting question.
Well, part of the problem, and I believe somebody at RavenCon described it best, is somebody writes a terrible romance novel with a lot of plot holes. They throw in a ghost or a vampire, and suddenly it's paranormal romance, and they throw it up there. And that's really the only problem with, Amazon genre categories and nonsense. But as far as paranormal romance goes, yeah, you do have some, and that are readable. And actually, I think that's part of the problem with why vampires are so verbose. There are so many different variations on them now. It's like, yes, we have to go into a 5-page soliloquy on, these are the rules we're using in this book.
Yes.
Otherwise, we break out the RPG manual and just explain it, kind of like Jim Butcher with werewolves in Full Moon, where it's like, well, there are 8 kinds of vampires, 8 kinds of werewolves, It's like, what?
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. Jim Butcher does have his werewolves describe their different, who gets hurt by silver and all the rest of it in Full Moon. But that's an interesting question.
But I think all the trends, when you talk about what are the trends in fantasy, are, well, let's bring in
Almost
noir from Raymond Chandler. Let's bring in weird westerns. Let's bring in this and that. It's like, let's take things that don't belong together and mush them together and see if anything interesting comes of it.
There seems to be a lot of kind of Lovecraftian type coming into urban fantasy too.
Yes, Lovecraftian does seem to be more on the rise, no pun intended. Actually, a friend of mine, Nate LaPointe, who actually looks a little bit like Lovecraft in his author photos, which is creepy, will usually have some kind of Lovecraftian eldritch horror.
Yeah.
Even
in his kids' stories.
Even in his kids' stories. And they're all surprisingly also gonzo action fantasy novels at the same time. I don't know how he pulls it off, but he does. Nate LaPointe, first book is called Chalk. It's Catholic schoolgirl versus demons, and it's a rabbit hole that literally goes all the way to Dante's Inferno. I'm not even making this up. I had one fellow reviewer who doubted me. He was very surprised when I was literal.
Yeah, he wrote a story for one of the Fantastic Schools anthologies that had a fuzzy slug. Our cover artist put it on the cover.
Okay.
A fuzzy slug.
I don't
It's a slug, but it was fur.
Oh, okay.
It was supposed to be an eldritch horror.
Yeah, it was a little horror thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So you like my picture?
So I feel like we've kind of mentioned action a lot as like a thread of what needs to be in urban fantasy. We had like explosions mentioned and everything.
Well, in modern urban fantasy, which I would track back to 1975, has anyone ever heard of Fred Saberhagen aside from me?
Sure.
Okay. In 1975, he had Dracula running around Chicago. And it was basically an action novel against other vampires. The pacing was different from, Larry Correa, where we have to have a shootout every 50 pages, or Harry Dresden, where we have to set something on fire every 30. 10. Okay, fine.
You're talking about Dominion,
Dominion was one. Old Friend of the Family was another.
the Dracula tapes.
Right.
What's
Yeah.
this like?
Yeah. Those were fun.
Yeah.
But every time somebody talks about the dawn of urban fantasy, they keep going into, oh, well, it's obviously Laurel K. Hamilton. It's like, no, you guys haven't read that far back.
So we had a short conversation about fantasy creatures and putting your own spin on it and everything. What is one fantasy creature that you have either used in your books and your spin on it? Declan's already talked about his vampire son, but I'm sure you could find something else. Or that you want to use but haven't used yet.
Well, let's start with Sand, because nobody's... We haven't heard from you in like 5-10 minutes.
So I used a thing called a Kentucky Howler, which I basically, finding that was a kind of a feat in and of itself. Looking through urban legend sites and stuff like that, it's basically a cat with horns that haunts the forests. And in my series, they basically kind of slip between the planes of reality, and they're sort of the watchdogs of the multiverse. So the main character starts some issues with the multiverse, and they're after him. So basically, he's having a chase through various realities, and they're all constantly on his tail.
So like a howler like screams like cougars do and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I
And-
basically describe him as like, a cat, a giant cat shaped like a bear with horns. And so.
I really do use almost everything. But I'll say one thing that's not actually from my series that has urban fantasy, but I have a friend who is the professional storyteller who every Halloween gets to recite the Legend of Sleepy Hollow in the church at the bridge of Sleepy Hollow. And he wrote a book called Legend Lore of Sleepy Hollow, where he researched every creepy thing that's in that story, of which there are, I don't know, 50 different, white ladies and, ghosts. And so I have a Halloween scene in my school that's on the Hudson River, and I got to put like almost all of them in. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing that. And it was, it was a little, they're not really, I mean, they're more ghosty than creatures, but there were some creatures there. But but one of my favorite things is researching fairy tales and what?
I object, Mom. The Rachel Griffin series is urban fantasy because it's happening right now.
What is happening today? But that's only true today. Next year, it will no longer be true.
Anyway, I'm actually starting to run out of creatures to kill off in my novels. I've come up to the point where it's like, yeah, I had one of my characters use his very much not a lightsaber against things that were very much not xenomorphs, because after a while I'm just starting to run out of things, and there are only so many search terms you can come up with. But I had a Wendigo running loose in a New York City hospital, and that was entertaining because I had to look up, so how many things in a hospital are actually made of silver, which are apparently actually annoy Wendigos? It's like, yes, fun was chemistry. And, I even had a sequence where it's, yes, we're going to go into Area 51, underneath Area 51, because that's where the U.S. government keeps all of the nasty supernatural things that they find and lock up. And it's run by a very cranky panda in a lab coat. And some of you might actually know the guy I based him on. And after a while it was, wait, you guys decided to come in here while all these idiots outside are trying to storm Area 51. Whose bright idea was that? And then the alarms go off because, yeah, it was somebody's bright idea. It was some fae who wanted to have a jailbreak. So yeah, I have fun, but I'm really starting to run out of monsters after a while. I have to look up more.
There's no end to monsters. I guess one of the moments of whimsy I've used recently. I had a small village along the Red Sea complaining that they were being harassed by a hydra, traditional hydra from Greek myth.
Nice.
I like to look into practical solutions to interesting problems. The village was poor, could barely feed itself because all of the young men had gotten killed by the hydra. The solution, of course, was, why don't we lean into it and not try and defeat the hydra, but try and make it more hydra-esque than ever. Let's cut off heads until there's so many replacement heads that what you have is kind of a giant bouquet of meat. Now there's an endless supply of meat for the village, and this hydra that has been so successful that two heads replace the one so often, it can't move and it can't. And anyway, it's like, okay, here's a very practical, useful hydra.
Please tell me it tastes like chicken.
I did a joke once where it's like two goblin-y types were forced by their human mistresses to eat chicken, and they didn't want to do it because they didn't know what that creature is that you're trying to serve me, and the whole idea is, try it. It tastes just like snake. But yeah, just a little bit of side fun in that's the Hammer of the Gods book that's available on Amazon. Anyway.
So I think I'm going to do one last question, and maybe we'll open up for a couple audience questions because we're getting close to our time. If someone has to read or watch an urban fantasy series that's not yours, they should obviously go get everybody's urban fantasy here. But if it's not one of those, what do you think people should be reading? Or, we can open up to other watching movies, that kind of thing. And we'll start with Dan.
Repairman Jack by Paul Wilson.
I have been, if you haven't gone, now in this audience, most of you have, I've been rewatching Angel, and I feel like it's really hitting a lot of the urban fantasy kind of tropes, and I've been enjoying it. It's not just because we used to publish him or he's on a panel with me. I really love Dan's Paxton Locke books. And it's also not because my husband is the director of his fictional government agency in the books. Yeah, so those are my two recommendations right now, are Angel and Paxton Locke.
I really love the movie Cast a Deadly Spell. I don't know if it's still available anywhere, but it starts out, it's 1948, everybody does magic.
I think it's a perennial on HBO.
It's the main character is named Lovecraft, and he's the only guy who doesn't use magic. He doesn't actually say outright that it's because magic is evil and gonna ruin your life. But it's great. I can quote lines and lines from it. I won't bother boring you guys with it now, but I recommend it if you haven't seen it. I just read something that has the mood of urban fantasy, though it was set, I think, in an alternate version of like the 20s or 30s. So it's a little earlier, but it was called The Midnight Show. And it took place in a world where it seemed to have fairies and people kind of knowing about each other. The main character is a young detective, who's hired because this famous singer is waking up every morning, her feet hurt and her shoes are worn out. So it's the 12th Princess fairy tale told as a detective trying to solve the problem in a kind of urban fantasy background. And I really enjoyed it. I think the author's name is Sarah Pennington, and I should say she's someone I know, which is why I read it. But I enjoyed it, and I felt she got the mood really well. She mixed the fairy tale and the noir feeling quite well in that book.
Okay, this is the part where the whole running a review website comes out. I have mentioned Nicholas Woodsmith's Cat Drummond series. Yes, they have mentioned Dan Humphreys' Paxton Locke series, but I will go so far as to say that if, God forbid, Jim Butcher should drop dead tomorrow, we do not need Brandon Sanderson to finish Harry Dresden. We've got Dan. I have mentioned N.R. Lapointe, or Nate. His Chalk series is fun. He's currently doing a science fiction series at the moment called Dinosaur Warfare. Long story. There is an ad in the bulletin called Body and Blood by Michael Gallagher. It's a fun horror urban fantasy that takes place in 2090, so that's fun. If you have not read Fables by Bill Willingham, you really should. Morgan's husband, Russell, has a book called War Demons. I don't know if it's urban fantasy, but it takes place in Athens, Georgia.
Yes.
And the final shootout involves a dragon at a football stadium, so that's fun. Okay, I think that's all the ones I have off the top of my head. And as far as media goes, I would recommend
Action.
digging up a TV show called Grimm, which was basically, Buffy as police procedural, only with all of the not just all the monsters out of the Brothers Grimm, but darn close. And of course, my stuff.
I don't have a series. I am especially fond of one of Roger Zelazny's lesser-known books called A Night in the Lonesome October. Has anyone read that?
Yes.
It is a urban fantasy told from the point of view of several familiars of literary characters you will recognize as they work out the problems of an incident that's coming up that gets a little bit H.P. Lovecrafty. It is just a delight. I tried to get Roger Zelazny to adopt me as his son the one time we met, and he was having none of it. But he is perhaps my favorite writer, in addition to all the others.
So Zelazny is also one of my favorite writers, as anybody who's read anything I've written knows. And Night in Lonesome October takes place over the 31 days of the month of October. Yeah. So this is a perfect time to go out and get it, and then you can start at October 1st and read a chapter a day. It's an excellent book.
All right, so, we're the last panel for the night, but we do not want to go on till the end of time. I will open up the floor for some questions.
We can go on until they run out of questions.
Anne. Okay.
Of course.
Oh,
Duh.
Actually, Tim Powers has a more recent one that is, I believe it's the Bennett family versus werewolves. By Brothers Keeper, I think. I don't know. You'll have to double check me.
Orville.
It's a silly question, but aren't hydras incredibly poisonous?
Yes and no. Traditional hydras, the one head that's like the main boss head is incredibly poisonous. So you got to trank the thing, get in there, take out the poison sac, and then make sure that in your harvesting you never cut that head off so that the others will continue to bloom.
So impressed he has this thought out.
Well,
Confirming you were trying to incredibly poison me.
yeah, there's a class I teach in hydro harvesting, and the license is a little expensive, but yeah.
How much would it cost?
How much would it cost? Or what?
And instead of going to college, you boys could take up hydro.
About a year's tuition at a good college is about the right ballpark. Yeah. A little more if you want someone competent teaching, because, well, look at me. My hydro hunting days are mostly behind me. You bet. Yeah.
Yeah, is that right back?
There was
Maybe.
Death Valley was actually partially produced and written by Spider-Man, Lindsay Apartment 5000. Ran for one season, I want to say 5 years ago. Taught on Hulu. It is urban fantasy. It is almost everything that you have been describing, but I haven't heard anybody even mention.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of
It's
it.
called Death Valley, and it was Netflix or
It seemed vaguely familiar. It kind of disappeared, didn't it?
like 2 seasons.
Oh, was it 2 seasons?
The end cliffhanger, and then it was.
See, I think I saw it, and I think I got the impression that they weren't going to solve anything as long as they were running the show. So,
Well, it was basically LA, except for the prostitutes and vampires. And,
yeah.
well, it's not really that old, but the other one was a very old Canadian ship. 11 o'clock at night in 1990.
Oh, something night. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Forever Night. Yeah.
Yeah, my sister was a fan of that show. Me, not so much. Oh, Kolchak was awesome.
Oh, Kolchak was.
But it's one season. I think you can still get it on DVD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was carried on the personality of
Darren McGavin.
Darren McGavin, but after the first one, even the second movie didn't quite hold it. It was Monster of the Month and Monster of the Week, and after a while you could see the tennis shoes sticking out of the rubber monster suits. It was a lovely memory that doesn't bear rewatching if you want to hold on to the lovely memory. Yeah.
Darren McGavin was pretty much, the 70s version of Nathan Fillion. Everything rested on his plus 10 charisma.
I saw that Ray had a question.
What if it's saying it's cyberpunk meets fantasy? That's the word for fantasy? It's a good question.
I think that's called cyberpunk fantasy. Because cyberpunk is its own specific flavor that I've encountered.
But is there cyberpunk fantasy? Now that seems to me like there might be room
There
there.
probably is.
Okay.
Yeah, Shadowrun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shadowrun's very noir.
Can I go on record that I hate any subgenre that ends in the word punk? I mean, I just, were you cool once when you said it, but after the second time, you're just a little bit sad. And don't get me started on steampunk. When I did my steampunk version of all the Dynamite characters, the Phantom and Flash Gordon, etc., etc.
Cool.
The $6 Million Man, who was the $6,000 man back then, steampunk, and no one could figure out how you could possibly spend that much money on a couple of limbs. But steam pulp is what I try to get people to change it to, and that's
nice.
That'd work.
but it didn't catch on.
Back in the 80s, I was in a green room listening to editors from New York talk, and they were talking about how, now that cyberpunk was big, they wanted to get cyber prep going, but it never caught on. Cyber prep. Preppy was big back then, so they wanted cyber prep. But it never caught on. I was kind of disappointed. It sounded like fun.
I now have a vision of RoboCop in high school.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I thought it.
Playing polo. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Nanotech polo shirt.
Someone is about to ask the most amazing question ever. I can feel it in my bones. Before you do, since after that, everyone's going to be so impressed they just want to go home and savor. I need one more player. If there's one more player in the room tonight that wants to sacrifice their lovely day tomorrow, there's a trophy in the game. And
Before
the
you run
game
out, let
board-
me ask one of my sons.
game board and
we
all
don't
the
have to
counters,
tomorrow because I have a
hand
panel at
painted,
11.
hand drawn. It's just an extravaganza. Anyway,
I have to be here. It's on Superversity.
Yeah.
I can't miss it. You could do it. You want to do it?
don't give up good panels for bad gaming. I mean,
No.
come
He
on.
thought we
What-
were going to
what were you
church, and
thinking?
I said we couldn't go to
Oh.
church because I have I do usually go
What?
to church.
Oh, there one slot for the minimum. There's a couple of slots open. There's 3 slots open.
Can I come to you after the panel before you leave?
It's like 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes to make
All
it.
right.
You can
But
do
anyway,
it.
that
Both
one perfect question. Well, the only one that looked really wise left. So
Who has the most amazing question ever to ask us before we leave?
No
Anyone?
pressure.
Yes. Yeah. I recommended Angel as a good urban fantasy show. Yes.
No
And it has
other
a lot more
series
than
ended
noir.
better than that. The perfect ending that could only be that group of people in that
Which
situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the only thing that ruined it was the comic series that followed had him survive it to justify a comic series to follow. But it was exactly the way something like that should have ended.
Clearly, comic
Perfect.
series is not it's apocryphal. It's not canon.
They died doing their job. Yeah, come on. That's Valhalla crap right there. It's just yeah.
Next question.
I'll give you the cliff notes.
Rob isn't here, so go.
I was one of the early writers of superheroes that tried to make them explained and practical, and I regret that. The elementals that preceded Dark Knight, preceded Watchmen, all that kind of stuff. I'm not taking pride of authorship here. I'm just giving you the dates, but and that helped start this whole idea of explaining everything. Then you have the Marvel Universe Handbook that explains exactly how Tony Stark's armor works and this and that, and exactly how a spider bite can cause Spider-Man to get these powers. And all of that explaining, every little bit of it reduced the power and wonder of the character every time you did it. It took me doing Fables for 13 years to realize superheroes are best as fairy tales. And the thing about fairy tales is you don't explain, you state. An author has a lot of power and authority. He says, this guy can put on his 7-league boots and do this because he put on his 7-league boots and can do this. Superman can pull a string of planets through space on a chain because he can pull a string of planets through space on a chain. That's the explanations you need. You want to provide an origin story with a spider bite? Fine. But stop there. Just now he can do this stuff. Superheroes are best when they're fairy tales. And fairy tales do not need to be explained. As a matter of fact, the more you explain them, the weaker they get as a character. So that's that's the tirade. I've got a much longer version, but yeah, it's time to stop.
All right. Thank you, guys. I believe we'll be back in the morning with panels starting at 9.